It's that isn't specifically based on a real house, but what it is based on is there was a guy called William Beckford who wrote Gothic novels, like in the first wave in the sort of 1760s onwards. And Beckford was like, if you did a list of the 100 worst people who's ever lived, he might well be on it. So he was the richest commoner in England off the back of slavery. His father was a massive slaver. He was highly involved in slaving, supervised them. He was also a big animal rights fan who wrote really sad letters about poor animals because it wasn't fair that the poor animals were being hurt while being a slaver. He was also a paedophile and an abuser and an adulterer and a really bad architect, and his book's not very good either. And frankly, I don't like him, but he was in between his many other ways of being a really awful human being. He built this incredible Gothic house called Fonthill Abbey, which had I think it's the tallest spire in Europe for about 6 weeks, and then it fell down. But it was this huge, magnificent, and he spent everything, like all of this money that he got off the blood and sweat and murder of people, he spent on building this insane building that fell down. So there's just something about it that obviously sticks in my craw quite a lot, but it's also fascinating. And one of the few buildings he built that didn't fall down is called Beckford's Tower in Bath, and you can actually stay there. So we went there and we did stay there for a weekend, and you can still see just the remains. And it's right next to the churchyard where his tomb is buried. He's got a tomb, and it's on this separate little hillock with sort of a moat round it to separate it off. And the local legend is that there's a tunnel that goes down. I mean, you know, the whole thing is mad as a spoon. But that was what was in the back of my mind, basically. Fonthill Abbey and this awful Gothic novelist. So in my book, the hero's grandfather was a Gothic novelist and a slaver, and the family inheritance is a huge amount of money and a huge amount of guilt, which not all of them recognise. In fact, most of them don't. But that is where the most of the money for all these great British houses, that's where it came from. If it was built after about, 1750, it's slavery money. And the National Trust is really starting to acknowledge that and put it in the literature. And when you go to Beckford's Tower in Bath, they absolutely make it clear, this is how he got his money. But at the time the book is set, which is about like 1904, this was not something that people were acknowledging. So basically, that was a big chunk of it, the Fonthill Abbey, the whole Gothic thing. But also, I love my Gothic novels. I studied them at college. I did an English degree. I love the first wave, starting with the Castle of Otranto and the whole invention of all the Gothic tropes that we know and love, including the big scary house. And I also love the Gothic novel of the 70s that this cover is completely channeling, it's usually got a woman in a white dress running from the house. And in mine, it does not. But although actually the book does start with a woman in a white dress running away from the house, because how could I not? Again, it's your classic Gothic setup, because really, if you go into a lot of Gothic novels, it's a house you can't get away from. Maybe you can't get away because, it's in the middle of nowhere, or because Dracula's wolves are hanging around, or because, as Beckford really did, there's a massive 12-foot wall around the property and you can't climb it. But being trapped in the house is a key trope of the Gothic. So yes, Zeb, big estranged family, doesn't speak to any of them. For reasons that are later revealed, he does decide to come and visit his cousin Wyn. And when he arrives, he discovers that there's a family reunion going on that he wasn't told about, and that his ex-lover is now Wyn's secretary, and that he can't get out. And he's then stuck with these people. Zeb was a character I hugely enjoyed writing. He's actually, which I didn't plan, but it emerged from his character in the course of the book. So, I obviously worked it up. He's got ADHD, which obviously wasn't a diagnosis in 1904. And I found it, I did quite a lot of work with several people who've got ADHD in order to try and make sure it was a strong portrayal, but really sort of try and dig into what it would be like to be struggling with this when when nobody I mean, I think it's bad enough now for people who don't get a lot of sympathy or help, or people understanding that their brains are just wired a bit differently from the norm. But in the days before people knew that there was such a thing as a neurological condition of that kind, it, you know, must have been pretty hellish. And his family are bad enough as it is. So Zeb is just in there, just trying to persuade his cousin to let him leave, trying to deal with, you know, the brother he hates and the cousin who he detests, and they're all fighting for an inheritance. And you know, it's basically all spirals from there because, of course, naturally, it's there's more to it than meets the eye. Of course, the big question in a Gothic novel is always, is it magic or is it real? Is it supernatural or is it a Scooby-Doo situation where somebody's behind the mask, which I'm not revealing now. But yeah, I've done several books that are absolutely, you know, fantasy with a big, strong magic element. Yeah, what do I'd say fantasy is probably the best way to put it. But you know, it kind of depends on the mood. So at the moment, I'm just finishing off a novel for Tor, which will be coming out in 2027, which is an occult fantasy. So it's very much rooted in the sort of occult practitioners of the 1920s, like Aleister Crowley and Dion Fortune. And that's got a very different feel to the kind of magic where you can sort of wave your hand and you know, turn things into birds or whatever. And all of that is also different from, you know, the kind that feels really academic and hardworking. So I love doing different flavors of magic. I'm very much at the moment, I'm in a much more sort of occult, creepy sphere. I don't know if that, I think there's a lot of horror going on at the moment, possibly because of the world, but a lot of people are, you know, moving into a horror space, which is quite fun. I think I'm definitely going a bit more that way. The Hound of the Baskervilles, of course, that's set on Dartmoor, and it's the, you know, you've got the Grimpenmire and the mists that roll in, and you know, the howling of the great mysterious hound through the mists. Kind of, Dartmoor is your classic setting. If you're English, you know, smugglers happen in Cornwall and strange, scary mists happen on Dartmoor, kind of thing. I mean, it's a lovely part of the world, very beautiful, very bleak, and the mists are actually something astonishing. If you ever get caught in one, they're quite scary. So that was that. It felt like the only possible place I could set the book. So the actual origin story of this book is really weird because I was trying to write a book about something completely different. And it's something I've been researching for ages. I can't, you know, when you've got an idea and you can't quite find your way into it as a novel, and you're trying to crowbar your way in, but you just can't see how it's going to work. And it was a bit frustrating. And I needed to go to the shops to buy halloumi specifically because my daughter's a vegetarian. So I went to the shops, and between my house and the shop that sells halloumi, the entire idea of Proper Script with the whole plot arrived in my head, which was not the book I was researching. It's a completely different book. Like out of nowhere, bam. And it was, you know, I sort of bought my halloumi and came back in a daze, and I had something like 3,000 words written by the end of that day. It was absolutely madness. Never had that before. Would like to have it again anytime, you know, please. Looking back on it, so Joel, the hero, the other hero, is a graphologist. So he can basically look at people's handwriting and interpret it. He can, you know, read their character from it, which is obviously something people like to think you can do. And it's something that lots of people wrote lots of very dull books about. It is also, to agree, something my grandmother actually could do. And this always sounds that no one ever believes it except people who saw her doing it, but she really could. I mean, my mother is a doctor, and when she had a difficult colleague to work with, she would show my grandmother the handwriting, and my grandmother would just say, you know, well, in one case, which I actually used for the book, my mum showed her boss's handwriting, said, "Why is she so awful?" And she said, "She's terrified. She's absolutely, you've got to praise her. She needs your praise." My mum was like, "No, she's my boss." And Granny was like, "Nope, you've got to praise her and tell her how good she is." So Mum, who's a very junior doctor, went back, told this very senior consultant how wonderful she was, and the woman melted. She's putty in my mother's hands ever since. My grandmother got that from reading handwriting. You know, my husband doesn't believe a word of this, but it is in fact true. So I gave Joel a version of that power, but amped up a great deal more just for the fun of it. And then it all, of course, it ties into the police because inevitably he reads murderer's handwriting, and then they have to solve a crime. But in fact, it was really interesting as well. So the whole police corruption theme. I mean, obviously that's something that's very much in the news at the moment. But when I delved into a lot of policing history, there was some really fascinating stuff. Like there was a very famous case, which I actually cite in the book, of a police sergeant who reported a colleague for taking bribes and was sacked in the most unfair way and dismissed in disgrace. And then the guy he'd accused was sent to prison for taking bribes 18 months later, and there was a huge scandal, and it was all in the House of Commons. But this was all going on, so it all tied in extremely nicely. That book is basically a huge act of serendipity. Everything just came together to and slotted very elegantly into place.